Imagine stepping aboard the most luxurious ship ever built. A floating palace of marble staircases, fine dining, electric lighting, and unimaginable wealth. The newspapers called her unsinkable. The engineers believed she was the safest ship ever constructed. More than 2,200 passengers placed their lives in her hands. Then, at exactly 11:40 p.m. on the night of 14th April 1912, everything changed. An iceberg emerged from the darkness. Less than 3 hours later, the Titanic had vanished beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people never came home. But this isn't simply the story of a ship. It's the story of ambition, human error, heroism, sacrifice, and the disaster that changed the world forever. Because what really happened during those final 2 hours and 40 minutes is even more extraordinary than the legend. To understand how Titanic died, you first have to understand why she was built. In 1907, two men sat down for dinner in London. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord Pirrie of the shipbuilders Harland and Wolff. Their rival Cunard had just unveiled two record-breaking ships. The Lusitania, the Mauretania, fastest liners in the world. White Star couldn't win a speed race, so they decided not to fight one. Instead, they would build the largest, most luxurious ships the world had ever seen. 3 sister ships were planned: Olympic, Titanic, Britannic. Construction began in Belfast on a purpose-built slipway because nothing large enough to hold her had ever existed before. 3 million rivets, 16 watertight compartments, sealed by electric doors the captain could close with a single switch. It took 4 years to build her. And somewhere in that process, a word began to attach itself to Titanic, a word that would follow her to the bottom of the ocean and never let go. Unsinkable. Here is where the story gets complicated. White Star never printed that word without a qualifier. Trade publications called her practically unsinkable. A promotional flyer said she was designed to be unsinkable. Passengers believed it. Crew believed it. Even Titanic's own captain, Edward Smith, had once said of an earlier ship, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder." Whether White Star sold that confidence or simply failed to correct it, historians still argue. What isn't in dispute is this. By the time Titanic left Southampton, the myth was already aboard, and it would shape almost every decision made in her final hours. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, more than 2,200 people walked up Titanic's gangways. And in that single act of boarding, the entire structure of Edwardian society came aboard with them. In first class, a ticket could cost the equivalent of over $60,000 today. Passengers changed clothing several times a day. Breakfast attire, afternoon tea attire, evening wear for a 10-course dinner in a dining saloon that spanned the width of the ship. John Jacob Astor, reportedly the richest man in America, was aboard. So was Isidor Straus, founder of Macy's, traveling with his wife Ida. In second class, conditions resembled a comfortable hotel, good food, a library, a live band of their own. And in third class, the story often told is that passengers were held below in squalor. That's not accurate. Compared to other liners of the era, Titanic's steerage was considered remarkably comfortable. Families had proper cabins. There was a general room, a nursery, hearty food included in the fare. Most were emigrants, families crossing the Atlantic toward a new life in America. Single men bunked at the bow, single women and families toward the stern. 3 classes, 3 completely different ships inside the same hull. And in less than 4 days, all 3 would face exactly the same iceberg. By April 14th, Titanic had received at least 6 warnings of ice ahead. Not all of them reached the bridge. One from the steamer Masaba described a field of heavy pack ice and great numbers of large icebergs directly in Titanic's path. The wireless operator handling it was busy relaying passengers' personal messages. It never made it to the officers. At 11:40 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet was in the crow's nest. No binoculars. They'd been misplaced earlier in the voyage, locked in a cabinet no one had the key for. Fleet saw something, a shape, darker than the night around it. He rang the warning bell 3 times and picked up the phone to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch had less than 40 seconds to react. He ordered the engines reversed and the wheel turned hard. Titanic didn't hit the iceberg head-on. She turned just enough to avoid that. Instead, an underwater spur of ice scraped along her starboard side for about 6 seconds. 6 seconds. That's all it took. The impact didn't tear one giant gash, as long believed. It sprang the seams between steel plates, letting water in through a series of narrow openings across 6 compartments. Titanic was built to survive 4 flooded compartments. Thomas Andrews did the math himself. He informed Captain Smith the ship had, at most, 2 hours left. It was 11:50 p.m. The band hadn't started playing yet. Most passengers were still asleep. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, enough by the Maritime law of 1912 for a ship her size, enough for barely half the people aboard her. At around 12:20 a.m., the first boats began loading. Many left half empty. Crew feared the davits couldn't hold a fully loaded boat's weight, or that passengers would panic and swamp them entirely. Women and children first. It's one of the most famous rules in maritime history, and one of the most complicated. Survival data compiled decades later would show something uncomfortable. Crew members, statistically, were more likely to survive than passengers were. Around 30 minutes after the collision, the ship's musicians began to play. 2 separate bands joined together for the first time in the first-class lounge. Survivors remembered lively tunes, ragtime. What they played in the final minutes is one of history's genuine, unresolved questions. Popular legend says, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Some survivors insisted otherwise. No one who could confirm it for certain lived to tell. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was seen on the boat deck urging passengers into lifeboats, more than once reportedly throwing deck chairs overboard as makeshift flotation. He did not survive. Captain Smith's final movements are less clear. Witnesses place him near the bridge as the ship went under. Whether he issued any final order or simply stood with his ship remains disputed. By 2 a.m., water reached the bridge itself. There were still hundreds of people on deck with nowhere left to go. At 2:18 a.m., the lights of Titanic flickered once, then failed completely. In the darkness, her structure could no longer bear the strain. The flooded bow pulling down, the air-filled stern still buoyant, 2 forces tearing against each other at the weakest point in her hull. Titanic broke in two. For decades, this detail was pure speculation, dismissed by many as impossible. Survivor Jack Thayer described it clearly at the time. He wasn't widely believed. The bow sank first, alone, disappearing into the dark. The stern briefly settled back onto the surface, then rose again, this time nearly vertical, before beginning its own final plunge. At 2:20 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, Titanic was gone. Hundreds of people were now in water, measured at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time in water that cold is measured in minutes, not hours. Most of the lifeboats, only partially filled, did not go back. Crews feared being swamped by desperate swimmers. The Carpathia, racing through the same ice field at dangerous speed, arrived roughly 2 hours later. She recovered 706 survivors. More than 1,500 did not return home. Within days, 2 formal inquiries began, one in Washington, one in London. They exposed uncomfortable truths. Ice warnings ignored. A dangerously low lifeboat count that had technically obeyed the law while failing every passenger aboard. A nearby ship, the Californian, whose wireless operator had switched off his set for the night, mere miles from the findings changed maritime law permanently. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, mandated lifeboat space for every person aboard and required ships to maintain a 24-hour radio watch. The International Ice Patrol was created and has operated ever. Titanic herself lay undiscovered for 73 years. In 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard found her, 2.5 miles down. Using technology developed for a mission the public wouldn't learn the truth about for years. A secret US Navy search for 2 lost nuclear submarines. Ballard's cameras confirmed what Jack Thayer had said all along. She had broken in two. More than a century later, we still return to this story, not simply for the tragedy, but because Titanic holds up a mirror to ambition and its limits, to the belief that engineering could outpace nature, to ordinary people forced into extraordinary choices in the coldest hour of their lives. She was built to be unsinkable. She taught the world permanently that nothing is. I'm the Archivist. Thank you for spending this hour with history.